Lena sat on the edge of her bed, her phone gripped tightly in her hands. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, but her eyes were distant, unfocused. It was 2:03 a.m., the time that would change everything. She had read the message over and over, each time with more disbelief. What if everything I've believed was a lie? She thought. The truth she had feared was now undeniable, but the pain of facing it was unbearable. The security of seeking approval, the constant effort to please, had been the foundation of her life for as long as she could remember. But now, standing at the edge of this revelation, she realized that the search for approval had never brought her freedom. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. She felt her chest tighten as the weight of it settled in. Approval was never going to make her free. She wasn't sure how to move forward, but the first step had already been taken. The veil had been lifted. She wasn't sure who she was without it, but she knew she couldn't go back. There was no going back. Lena stared at her reflection in the mirror, still holding her phone. It was as if she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her, the woman who had spent so many years trying to meet others' expectations, trying to please, trying to fit. She had built a life around others' approval, thinking that once she had it, she'd be free. But here she was, still waiting for a moment that had never come. The approval she craved had been nothing but a mirage, an illusion that evaporated the moment she stopped chasing it. And now, in the quiet of the night, Lena was left with the raw, uncomfortable truth. Approval would never make her feel whole. She had traded pieces of herself for acceptance, and it was time to ask the hardest question of all. Who was she without the validation of others? Lena let out a long breath as she placed the phone down on the nightstand. The weight of her own breath echoed in the stillness of the room. The question that had never left her mind for years now burned through her like a fire. How had she become so disconnected from herself? The truth, though it had hit her with a jolt, was liberating in its own way. She realized that her entire life had been governed by the need for validation. Even when she thought she was living authentically, it was always tethered to the approval of others. Was this the way it was meant to be? Was she merely living a script someone else had written for her, chasing a dream that didn't belong to her? She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't pity. It was the awakening of a long-buried grief, the grief of realizing how much time she had spent in the prison of others' expectations. But as the grief began to settle, she also felt something else, a glimmer of hope. If approval wasn't the answer, what was? The night felt long as Lena wandered around her room aimlessly. Her thoughts were like a whirlwind, each one faster than the last. Could she truly break free from this need for approval? It was so deeply embedded in her that it was like breathing, so automatic, so second nature, she had never questioned it. But now, there was a crack in the foundation. It was unsettling, and yet part of her wanted to explore it. The illusion she had clung to for so long was starting to fall apart. She could feel it, almost physically, like something in her chest was being loosened. She didn't know what the next step would be, but there was one thing she was sure of. She could no longer live in the shadow of what others thought of her. This journey wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she might just be ready to start living for herself. Lena stopped pacing, her body finally exhausted from the internal battle. She collapsed onto her bed, staring up at the ceiling. The air felt heavier now, as if it had thickened with the weight of her thoughts. Her eyes moved to the phone resting on the nightstand, the very object that had sparked this shift. It wasn't the phone that had changed her. It was the message, the realization of how deeply her identity had been tied to something that was always out of reach. How many times had she sought approval, only to be left feeling empty? How many times had she believed that success and recognition would fill the void, only to find it still there, lurking? The truth now felt undeniable, but it also felt like the beginning of something. There was no going back to who she had been. Lena knew she was standing on the precipice of change, though she wasn't sure what that change would look like just yet. She took a deep breath, the first calm one in what felt like ages. Lena sat quietly in her favorite chair, the worn fabric comforting her as her mind drifted back to her childhood. The approval of others had been a survival mechanism, something she'd learned early on. Her parents, with their unspoken expectations, had demanded perfection, never satisfied, always seeking more. She had learned to silence her own needs, to conform, to seek out what they wanted, not what she needed. Looking back now, she could see the pattern she had lived by all her life. The desire to be seen, to feel loved, had turned into a desperate quest for validation. But somewhere along the way, she lost sight of herself in the process. Lena remembered the first time she had tried to please her parents. It was a simple moment, a drawing she had done in art class. She had worked hard, but when she showed it to her mother, the response was lukewarm. The validation she had craved never came. Instead, her mother simply said, "Do better next time." It was a small moment, but it shaped her. From then on, Lena sought approval in everything she did, believing that love could only be earned through achievement. It was a lesson that stuck with her, even when it no longer served her. Lena continued to reflect on how she had shaped herself to fit into what others wanted. Her friends, her colleagues, even her lovers had all received versions of her that weren't fully real. She had always been the helper, the one who put others' needs first, afraid of disappointing anyone. The idea of losing approval was terrifying, yet it was an illusion that had always controlled her. Lena knew now that the masks she wore weren't for others, they were to protect herself from the emptiness she felt when she wasn't enough. But as the truth about her life began to surface, she understood something more. She had been surviving, not living. The deeper Lena delved into her past, the more she understood how much of herself had been buried. The quiet moments, when no one was watching, were the times when she felt most alive. She remembered walking in the park alone, feeling the cool breeze against her skin, the scent of earth and grass filling her senses. Those moments were her rare escapes, her small rebellions. But they were fleeting. In the back of her mind, she always returned to the need for validation. Her worth had always been determined by how others saw her. The truth was, she had never truly seen herself. Lena stood by her window, looking out into the night. The world outside seemed so distant, almost unreachable. Her thoughts kept returning to her past, to the years spent trying to please, to the versions of herself she had created. She had always believed that success and validation would bring her peace, but now she realized how far off the mark she had been. It was as if a curtain had been drawn back, and she could finally see the truth. Her need for approval had kept her in a constant state of longing. But the question lingered. What would it be like to live for herself? To find peace within? It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Lena had hoped that the realization would bring clarity, but instead, it felt like the beginning of an avalanche. Each day, the weight of her decision to change grew heavier, and the pressure from her family didn't help. Her mother's disapproving glance, her father's silence, it all pressed down on her. Every conversation seemed to echo her past decisions, the ones that had kept her small, the ones that ensured their approval. She found herself caught in an endless loop, wanting to break free, yet fearing the consequences of doing so. The familiar voices in her life now felt like walls closing in. The more Lena tried to live for herself, the louder the chorus of criticism became. She couldn't silence them, but the cost of giving in was becoming clearer by the day. How could she embrace the truth if it meant alienating everyone she loved? Lena's phone buzzed again, another message from her mother. "We need to talk about your decision," it read. It was a familiar tone, calm on the surface, but heavy with the expectation that she would revert to her old ways. For years, Lena had sacrificed parts of herself to maintain peace, to keep the approval flowing. But now, each message felt like a tether, pulling her back into the life she was trying to escape. Her mother's disappointment had always been her greatest fear, and now it seemed unavoidable. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother that she was done performing, that she wasn't going to be who they expected anymore. But Lena wasn't sure if she was ready for that confrontation. Could she hold firm to the truth, or would she crumble under the weight of the familial expectations that had defined her for so long? Lena decided to confront her father the next day. She hadn't yet told him about her plans to step away from the constant need for approval, but the weight of his silent judgment was unbearable. She sat across from him at their worn kitchen table, the smell of coffee filling the room. Her father's weathered face looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to offer up the same old justifications for her actions. But Lena had none left. She had reached the point where the lies no longer worked, where the mask she wore felt suffocating. "I'm not happy," she confessed quietly, her voice trembling. "And I haven't been for a long time." Her father's silence felt deafening, as if he were processing a reality that didn't fit the life he had always known. She waited for his response, but the air between them grew heavier with every second. Would he understand? Or would this be the moment that broke everything? The conversation with her father had not gone as Lena had hoped. He had stayed silent for most of it, only offering a few terse words of disappointment. "You know, Lena, I've always done what was expected of me," he finally said. "But life isn't about doing what feels good. It's about duty." The words stung, but Lena didn't back down. She wanted to scream, to tell him how suffocating his expectations were. But all she could do was nod and force a smile. The truth was that her father didn't understand her need to break free. His version of love was rooted in obligation, not choice. Lena walked away from that conversation with more certainty than ever, but also with a deeper fear. Was she ready to let go of everything she had known, even if it meant severing ties with the people who had shaped her? Lena sat alone in her apartment that evening, the city lights flickering outside her window. The conversation with her father had left her feeling more isolated than ever, but also more certain of the path she needed to take. She couldn't keep living for the approval of others. The price was too high, but the path forward wasn't clear. She felt the pull of her past, the fear of being alone, of losing everything she had worked for. Was it possible to step into the unknown and embrace her true self, even if it meant losing her family? Lena knew she had to let go of the old version of herself, the one that fit neatly into everyone else's expectations. But how could she move forward when the fear of rejection still gripped her heart? Lena had always admired her mother's strength, the way she carried herself with such authority, the way she kept everything together despite the chaos beneath the surface. But as the years passed, Lena began to see a different side to her mother. During their last conversation, something shifted in the way her mother spoke. "You think you're the only one who's had to sacrifice," her mother had said, her voice colder than Lena had ever heard before. "I did what I had to do to survive, and you're not the first to try to change everything." It was a statement that had lingered in Lena's mind. Could it be that her mother had been trapped in the same cage of approval she had tried to escape? For the first time, Lena wondered if her mother's strength had always been a mask, hiding her own deep fears and regrets. The idea felt like a revelation, one that made her question everything she thought she knew about the woman who had shaped her. Lena's heart raced as the truth settled in. Her mother's words had opened a door to a painful realization. She was not the only one trapped by the need for approval. Her mother had sacrificed parts of herself too, just as Lena had in a different way. But it wasn't just that. Lena's mother had been trying to protect her, sheltering her from the pain she had faced. All these years, Lena had viewed her mother as the unwavering figure of strength. But now she saw her for what she truly was, someone who had endured her own battles and kept silent, someone who had hidden behind the same fear of rejection. This revelation shook Lena to the core. Could it be that her mother had been living with the same internal conflict all these years? The thought was both comforting and heartbreaking. Lena now understood. The story she had built in her mind about her mother was incomplete. This twist of truth could change everything. Lena couldn't shake the thought. She had always thought that her mother had been the strong one, the one who had it all figured out. But now she saw that she too had been playing a role. Her mother had hidden behind the same wall of expectations, the same need for validation, just like Lena had. Lena's mind reeled with this new understanding. It was as if the pieces of her life, the ones that never seemed to fit, had suddenly clicked into place. Her mother's disapproval, her father's silence, her own need for approval, All of it was rooted in the same place, a deep fear of being vulnerable, of showing the world who they truly were. Lena had spent so many years chasing something that didn't exist, but now, in the quiet of this revelation, she began to see a way forward. If she could accept the truth of her mother's vulnerability, maybe she could finally accept her own. Later that night, Lena sat alone in her apartment, feeling the weight of everything she had just learned. Her mind replayed the conversation with her mother, but now the words felt different. She had been searching for freedom, for a way to stop living for others, but perhaps the key was in embracing vulnerability. Not just her own, but the vulnerability of others. Lena realized that her mother's strength had always come from carrying the weight of the world alone, but now she was seeing her as a woman who had been burdened by the same fears she carried. There was no quick fix, no sudden solution, but Lena understood now that she wasn't alone in her struggle. It wasn't just about breaking free from the approval of others. It was about accepting that we are all flawed, all vulnerable, and that we must learn to live with that truth. As the days passed, Lena began to see her family differently. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable now appeared fragile, as if everything she had built around her was made of the same fragile material as her own identity. She saw her mother's role in her life not as a source of approval, but as a mirror reflecting the fear they both shared. Lena understood now that she couldn't change her mother, just as she couldn't change her own past. But what she could change was how she viewed herself and her place in the world. She didn't need her mother's approval to be enough. She didn't need anyone's approval. The truth was freeing, and for the first time, Lena felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would take her, but she knew one thing. She was ready to face it with her true self, unapologetically. Lena stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into someone else's mold, trying to meet expectations she never agreed to. Now, with everything she had learned, with all the pain and the growth, she stood at a crossroads. There was no turning back. The decision before her was the hardest she would ever make. She could return to the comfort of approval, where she knew what was expected of her, or she could step into the unknown. Lena knew the cost of change. It would alienate her from the people she loved, and it would require her to face the deepest fears she had buried for so long. But the truth of who she was now felt undeniable. It was time to choose herself, even if it meant losing everything. As the weight of that decision settled in, Lena took a deep breath. "I am enough," she whispered to her reflection. For the first time, she believed it. Lena felt her heart pounding as she walked into the living room, where her family was gathered. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. She had been avoiding this moment for weeks, unsure of how to explain her decision, but the time had come. "I need to talk to all of you," she said, her voice steady but trembling. Her family's eyes turned toward her, expectant and curious. But there was a coldness in the air. Her mother sat on the couch, her arms crossed, her face hard with unspoken judgment. Her father, as usual, said nothing, his silence loud enough to fill the room. This was it. Lena's heart raced, but there was no turning back. She took another deep breath. "I'm done living for you," she declared, the words falling from her lips with a finality she hadn't expected. "I'm choosing me now." The silence in the room was deafening. Lena could feel her family's judgment without them saying a word. Her mother's lips were pursed, her eyes narrowed in disbelief, while her father remained silent, his face a mask of disappointment. The tension was suffocating, but Lena refused to back down. This was the moment she had been preparing for. "I'm not asking for your approval," she continued, her voice more confident now. "I'm telling you that I am choosing to live for myself, to make decisions based on what I need, not what you want." Her mother's face twisted in frustration, and for a moment Lena thought she might break. But she didn't. She stood tall, facing them both. "I don't expect you to understand, but I'm done apologizing for who I am." The room was still, the air thick with unspoken words. But Lena didn't need their approval anymore. The only approval she needed was her own. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for their response. Her mother finally spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "You think you're the only one who's suffered? The only one who's had to sacrifice? This family is not just about you." Her mother spat, her words cutting through the room. But Lena didn't flinch. She had spent too long living for her mother's approval, for her father's silence, and it had only left her hollow. "I don't want to live for anyone else anymore," Lena said firmly. Her voice was calm, but the words carried the weight of everything she had held back for so long. "I'm not asking you to accept me, but I'm not asking for your permission to live my life anymore." There was a long pause, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, for the first time in her life, Lena felt the ground beneath her feet shift. It wasn't approval that mattered anymore. It was her own peace. Lena stepped back, her heart racing, but she knew she couldn't take back the words. She wasn't sure what the future held, or if her family would ever understand, but she finally felt free. For the first time in years, she wasn't bound by anyone's expectations but her own. The weight of her decision hung in the air, but it was a weight she could finally bear. As she walked toward the door, she turned one last time to look at her family. Her mother's eyes followed her, disappointment still heavy in her gaze. But Lena didn't look back. The old life, the one that had been built on lies and approval, was over. She stepped into the unknown, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. Lena walked through her apartment, the space feeling different now. The silence that once weighed on her now felt peaceful, like a void waiting to be filled with the truth of who she had become. Her surroundings seemed familiar, but she was no longer the person she once was. The small things that once overwhelmed her now felt like the foundation for something new, a life she was beginning to build for herself. She stood by the window, looking out at the city, realizing that she no longer sought approval from anyone. She was starting to live for herself, and that freedom tasted both sweet and intimidating. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Lena felt confident enough to embrace it, without apology. The phone buzzed, and Lena hesitated before picking it up. It was her mother. Lena had been avoiding contact not out of anger, but because she wasn't ready for another round of disappointment. Yet, something in her shifted. She had already made her decision, and if they couldn't accept it, that was no longer her burden. She pressed answer. The conversation began awkwardly, her mother's voice strained, but Lena didn't shrink back. For the first time, she spoke openly, telling her mother that she couldn't live for anyone else anymore. It was a slow, painful realization for her mother, but Lena was no longer afraid of the consequences. The conversation ended with a quiet understanding, and though it was far from perfect, it felt like a breakthrough. The following days were filled with small, meaningful changes. Lena spent more time at the park, walking without a specific destination. She went out with friends without the need to impress them. For the first time, she felt like she was doing things because she wanted to, not because it was expected. Her work felt different too. She stopped, pretending to be perfect, and embraced the flaws that made her human. People at work began to notice the shift in her, how she no longer played the role of the overachiever, but instead brought a more authentic version of herself to the table. She had feared being seen as less than, but in truth, she was more than she had ever been. Weeks passed, and Lena started to feel more comfortable in her own skin. The tension she had once carried, the constant striving to meet others' expectations, was gone. She found herself enjoying the quiet moments, a cup of tea in the morning, reading a book without checking her phone every few minutes. Her relationships became more genuine, free from the burden of performance. She began to heal the distance between her and her family, not by seeking their approval, but by simply being honest about who she was. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Lena had let go of the idea that she needed others to validate her existence. And with each passing day, she found herself more whole. One morning, Lena stood by the window, looking out over the city. The world outside felt full of possibilities, and for the first time, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She had found her place in it, not as the person everyone wanted her to be, but as who she truly was. The journey had been long, but Lena had finally come to terms with the fact that she didn't need to prove anything. She had lived for so long in pursuit of approval, but now she understood that the only approval that mattered was her own. She was enough, just as she was. And in that moment, with the sun rising in the distance, Lena knew she had arrived at the place she had always been seeking. Freedom, not from the world, but from the expectations that had once held her captive. Lena stood alone in the hallway, the door to her apartment slightly ajar. The weight of the past few months, the decisions, the changes, suddenly felt overwhelming. But there was no going back. She had already made her choice, and now it was time to live with it. "I'm not going to keep auditioning for my own life," she whispered to herself. It was the truth she had been avoiding for so long, but now it felt as natural as breathing. She wasn't going to seek anyone's permission to exist anymore. She would live for herself, unapologetically. There was no audience left to please, no role to play. Lena wasn't waiting for approval anymore. She had claimed her life as her own. Lena walked through the streets, the world around her moving in its usual pace, but she no longer felt like an outsider. The noise, the hustle of the city, no longer felt like an overwhelming pressure. Instead, it felt like the backdrop to her life, a life she was fully inhabiting for the first time. The road ahead was unknown, but it was hers to walk. The fear that had once kept her frozen had begun to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. She didn't need to be anyone else. She had found the courage to simply be herself. And in that acceptance, she felt the weight of a lifetime of expectations lift off her shoulders. There was no more waiting, no more pretending. This was her truth, and she was finally ready to embrace it. As she walked further, Lena passed by familiar places, but everything felt different now. The coffee shop where she used to sit and pretend to be happy, the park where she would meet friends just to keep up appearances, all of it seemed distant now. The version of herself that existed there was gone. She had let that person go, and as she let go of her past, she felt herself grow into the space she had once feared. For the first time in a long time, Lena felt light, free from the heavy burden of trying to meet everyone's expectation. The past was no longer a chain, it was a stepping stone. She had made peace with it, and with herself. Lena reached the park and sat down on a bench, the air crisp and fresh. She watched the people around her, families, friends, strangers, all going about their lives. But this time, she didn't feel the urge to compare herself to them. For the first time, Lena was just present, living in the moment without the constant worry of how she measured up. The inner critic that once dictated her every move was silent now. She had silenced it for good. There was no longer a need to be better or perfect. There was only the joy of being. Lena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the park settle around her. She had arrived at the place she had been searching for her whole life. And for once, she was content, simply being. As the sun began to set, Lena stood up from the bench, taking one last look at the park. She knew that there was still much ahead of her, still work to be done in rebuilding her relationships, her career, her life. But she was no longer afraid. She had embraced her own truth, and that was the first step toward everything else. As she walked away, she no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. She wasn't auditioning for her own life anymore. The final blow had come, and Lena had emerged stronger, more whole than she had ever been. The path was hers to walk, and for the first time she knew that she could walk it with her head held high,